In terms of the popular culture, the word reboot has now come to mean both remake but without the implication that the original is being replaced, or, look, we know it's way too soon to do a remake, but we are, so we're gonna call it something else. That's linguistically obnoxious, but whatever you want to call it, in this age of near instantaneous nostalgia, the concept isn't going away. Fortunately, as it turns out, reboots aren't always all that bad. There's a new Ninja Turtles that people seem to really like, the new Tomb Raider was excellent, Man of Steel is kind of like a reboot and that's looking pretty good. I haven't myself seen the rebooted Hannibal Lecter or Psycho TV shows, but people are telling me they're pretty decent. So I started wondering if I could come up with anything that I wouldn't mind seeing rebooted, setting as my thought exercise ground rules that I'd keep it to TV and movie franchises because the mechanics are a little different for comics or games, and that it would have to only be stuff I thought would actually stand some updating and reworking, not just revival. For example, I almost put Darkwing Duck on here, but Darkwing Duck was fine the way it was. I don't want a reboot of it, I'd just like some more. Long story short, I came up with a list of 10 things I think ought to be rebooted, and I think it's a pretty good list, and over the next 2 episodes, I'm gonna give it to you, starting with number 10. Howard the Duck is today almost exclusively remembered for the bizarrely lifeless movie that got made out of it in 1984, but he started out as an older audience's targeted 1970s Marvel Comics character created by Steve Gerber that wound up being one of the few attempts at merging the then-hot underground comic style with mainstream superhero books. And even after the movie crashed and burned, Howard has been observed bouncing around the Marvel Universe on a semi-regular basis to this day. Now, I'm one of the people who honestly thinks the 1984 movie isn't really all that terrible, but I definitely think this is a character for whom a second chance is well in order. The basic joke of an existentialist parody of Disney-style anthropomorphic animal characters would be fertile ground for a TV series at the very least, but if they did want to try another feature, I'm reasonably certain Marvel does own the movie rights to this one, and it's not like he'd be the weirdest thing slated to turn up in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Number 9. Let's face it, the question of whether or not anyone cares about the Terminator franchise without Schwarzenegger seems to have been answered, but somehow I still think there's life left in this franchise, just maybe with some major retooling. The nice thing about Terminator is that it has time travel and altered histories built into its narrative DNA, so you've got a pretty good license to just decide that if the certain events can happen later or out of sequence or however you like, you just can. So if it is true that the Terminator franchise is really only interesting when it's a time-traveling robot going through similar names in a phone book, well, there's at least thematically sound excuses to go back and just do that again, especially given how many more twists the T-800's hunt for Sarah Connor can take in the age of public profiles and social media. Number 8. Gummy Bears was basically the beginning of Disney being involved in TV animation, a move which arguably helped raise the bar for the medium by bringing the studio's unmatchably high-caliber production value to the small screen. Plus, it was actually a pretty good show, a medieval fantasy series with an expansive cast and a sprawling internal mythology. The only thing that held it back in retrospect was the preference for insular and episodic storytelling in the era in which it was made. The series did have a mythos and characters went through arcs, but often inconsistently. Some episodes play like Game of Thrones with bears, while others aren't that far removed from better-written versions of the Smurfs. A present-day revival produced in a DVD and on-demand era where longer-reaching storylines and consistent characters are more valued, built on the lessons of what did work on the original, and modern examples like Adventure Time and even Friendship is Magic to draw from, could easily be a big winner, particularly since the thematic mandates of the 80s demanding that potentially menacing villains like Duke Igthorn constantly be proven incompetent no longer really apply, which could be more interesting. Number 7.
Not the mama, not the mama, not the mama, not the mama, not the mama.
You do that one more time and I'm gonna throw you across the room.
Whee! Oof. Again!
Call this a guilty pleasure of mine. Airing for barely 2 seasons on ABC, Dinosaurs was pretty much just The Simpsons with dinosaurs, but it was funny and did a lot with the basic premise. As high-concept Jim Henson projects go, it isn't exactly Fraggle Rock, but then what is? It was actually pretty popular in its day, but it never became quite big enough to justify the high production cost of a show cast entirely with elaborate animatronic suits and puppets. But today, more affordable materials and computer animation could very well allow the premise like this to be achieved without breaking the bank. Plus, somehow this is still on the air, so I feel like the bar is a little lower for sitcoms these days. Number 6. The first Men in Black movie felt like the beginning of something interesting, an action comedy series built less on 1 or 2 individual heroes and more on a whole organization with a specific function. Unfortunately, both the not bad animated series and the very bad sequels largely refused to expand on this, preferring to constantly revert back to versions of the J and K dynamic. While it's entirely possible that the whole thing could become beside the point if Joss Whedon's S.H.I.E.L.D. franchise really takes off on TV, I still think there's tremendous potential in this concept. If they were to bring it back, refocused on the agency and its multiple members, missions, and dynamics rising out of that, it could be a really interesting idea, especially given how prominent themes of government surveillance, immigration, and integration have become in recent years. And no, it doesn't need Will Smith, or Tommy Lee Jones, or the Dog, or even the Worm guys. It needs a script and a directing producing team that's actually excited about the possibilities of the material, not just how much money can be made off people's nostalgia for the one time the series was good. Okay, there's 5. For the next 5, I'll see you next time. Last week, a bunch of things I thought ought to be rebooted. This week, the rest of the list. Number 5. The Monster Squad is one of those memorable but also not terribly great movies that my generation spectacularly overrates because the idea behind it was awesome, and the parts that are good are really, really good. It's the story of a gang of middle school kids obsessed with classic horror movies who find themselves on the front line when their town comes under attack by an all-star team of universal monsters. Dracula, Frankenstein, Wolfman, the Mummy, and the creature from the Black Lagoon. The monsters all looked great, and there's some pretty spectacular makeup effects gore, but the tone is all over the map, and the kids range from annoying to bland. They're kinda like The Goonies, which actually was a great movie and still holds up, without all the personality and depth. If ever there was an inconsistent pseudo-classic nostalgia movie screaming for a do-over, Monster Squad is it. Number 4. Okay, look, before you kill me, hear me out on this one, okay? Alright, the Harry Potter series, taken as a whole, is really, really good. When you look back over the whole big sweep of the series, with the whole plot and universe laid bare, the fact that it not only holds up, but holds up pretty well, given what a massive and lengthy undertaking this was, is simply extraordinary. That said, hey, you want to sit down and watch every movie in a row with me? Start to finish? Anybody? Huh, didn't think so. 'Cause I can do that with Star Wars, and The Godfather, and Lord of the Rings. Hell, I've done it with the Marvel movies. I mean, I leave and make lunch and check my email during the second act meander in Iron Man 2, but I leave it on. But look, the Potter movies as individual movies have a lot of disposability in them. I mean, once you've seen Quidditch, you've kind of seen Quidditch. The movies themselves vary wildly in quality, and just in terms of following the relevant continuity story points, you really only need to watch the first 10 to 15 minutes and the final 20 minutes of everything in between Sorcerer's Stone and Half-Blood Prince. That doesn't make the filler movies bad. They're not. They're just kind of what happens when you're obligated to film every book because you started making these movies before the books were done and no one really knew how it was going to end and what would and wouldn't end up being important in the grand scheme of things. Look, all I'm saying is at some point Warner Brothers is going to want to make more money off Harry Potter, and maybe it wouldn't be such a bad thing if they opted to just retell the established story as, say, a more compact trilogy that might have a more deliberate naturalistic flow now that we know what the really important beats are. Obviously this won't recreate the unique experience of watching those kids age into adulthood in real time, but it might be worthwhile in and of itself. Number 3. Yet another often overlooked groundbreaking series from Disney Animation, Gargoyles was an ambitious attempt to fuse the styles of what was then the rapidly growing anime fad, Dark Age comic books, and the Mouse House's popular TV animation style to create another Ninja Turtles-style superhero creature franchise. The series was based around the adventures of a family of castle-defending nocturnal gargoyles awakened in present-day New York after a curse turned them permanently to stone for centuries, and it's grounded in an ever-expanding roster of characters mixing ancient mythology and then-current cyber-thriller technobabble. It was decently popular in its day, but it never quite got popular enough to sustain its production costs, and the Disney of the 90s didn't place nearly as high a premium on wooing teenage audiences as it does today. And the strictures of running an episodic animated series in the family viewing time left some of the creators' more ambitious ideas buried in the subtext or cut out altogether. For example, creator Greg Wiseman said he intended the character Lexington to be gay, but wasn't able to be upfront about it. In other words, it was a series ahead of its time, and while the originals are perfectly good as they are, that's also what makes it exactly the sort of series that could thrive in today's less restrictive environment. Number 2. Speaking of ahead of its time, Babylon 5 was a science fiction series from J. Michael Straczynski that was trying to do a complete pre-planned multi-season narrative in an era when getting renewed more than one season at a time generally didn't happen for expensive genre shows and definitely didn't happen in syndication. The series took place in the aftermath of an intergalactic war between Earth and an advanced alien race called the Minbari, which ended under mysterious circumstances when the Minbari gave up on the verge of their own overwhelming victory for reasons they're initially unwilling to make clear, and was set primarily in the titular space station that served as a kind of diplomatic neutral zone between the various planets and cultures jockeying for political position. Over the course of 5 seasons, characters played out elaborate interconnected arcs spanning years against a backdrop where alliances and even whole societies changed completely almost as often as they do in real politics. At one point, the station was even at war with Earth itself. While Straczynski got an impressive amount of what he wanted on screen, some of his bigger ideas were hampered by broadcast standards, casting changes, and the realities of not knowing which stories he'd ultimately get to finish because of uncertain season renewals. Overall, the series is still pretty damn spectacular and a personal favorite of mine, but if they gave this one the Star Trek reboot treatment, I'd be first in line to check it out. And number 1 is... I know. I'm the guy on record as still thinking The Simpsons is solidly, consistently funny. But I'm also the first to acknowledge that funny or not, at this point, it's pretty much jogging in place. You're allowed to do that when you're as important a cultural touchstone and as well-oiled a machine as The Simpsons is by now. But at some point, it's gonna end. They'll finally lose an irreplaceable cast member, Matt Groening will decide he finally has exactly enough money, something will happen, and it will end. But the by now invincible marketability and cultural prominence of the franchise probably won't. I mean, these are some of the most internationally iconic fictional characters in human history. People will be looking at them and saying, you know, there are places yet to go with this guy, or that guy, or her, or them. And you know what? I think that would be pretty awesome. It may sound like sacrilege, but I actually get pretty excited thinking about seeing new interpretations of the characters freed from their model sheets and canon that have defined them for almost 3 decades now. A lot of interesting things happened when subsequent generations of writers and artists got their hands on Disney, Warner Brothers, Hanna-Barbera, and other vintage cartoons. I don't see any reason why The Simpsons would be any different. There's somebody out there with a radical reinterpretation of Disco Stew kicking around in their heads, and I want to see what it is. And that's my reboot roster. Feel free to disagree with me in the forums. I'm Bob, and that's the big picture.